Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Today, we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be covering an episode of the No Jumper podcast. And if you are familiar with the No Jumper podcast, you know how odd this is. This is not a podcast that has come up in my feed before, but I think I know why. So there's two things that I think caused these two comments to collide and suggest this video. The first one being that I have recently watched most of a full episode of the No Jumper podcast that Ruslan KD was on, which I thought was pretty good. I think he did a pretty good job with that. You can go watch that. And then I also just a day or so ago, I think, watched a full panel that Vice put on feminism. And then the girl that's in this podcast was also on that panel. And I think the Ruslan and the Vice panel coming together, the YouTube algorithm that does suggest all the things that here, you should watch this as well. So altogether, would not suggest watching this podcast, but there are some very interesting cultural implications. So the one with Ruslan on it really intrigued me about like kind of how this host, which his name is Adam, I guess his rap name is Adam22, how he like is approaching culture from his worldview. And I thought, well, that's totally outside of how I would approach culture. And then so as we got through this podcast, and his guest here, Pearl, is talking about a lot of the things that how she sees the world, and she's espousing much more conservative sort of takes throughout this podcast. And then we get to this point, which is at the 50-minute mark, in which this is the part I really want to talk about. We're going to watch this part and kind of just talk about sort of these worldviews that are colliding here and sort of what it can tell us about our culture. Let's go over here to the review screen. And again, this is starting at the 50-minute mark, and they just got done talking about, something I don't want to talk about. And then we're going to get into it here now, because this is where the conversation shifts. He asked her a different question that I thought was really interesting, because he's assuming that she's the believer based on the fact that she's espousing conservative talking points, which she's not, but she'll explain that. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'll stop it as needed, and then we'll talk through it.
To what extent does your Christianity or your religious faith play into your views on relationships and everything?
Oh, I don't think I'm that religious.
You don't?
No, I mean, I've had periods. I go in and out. I grew up Catholic, so I did 12 years at Catholic school. And then I joined a Christian church right after college. Right after college, and I did Bible study a lot for 2 years. But I got a lot of things about the church that just bothers me. I feel like feminism has infiltrated the church. So
okay, so real quick, it's a very interesting question that he asked, right? Because he's assuming that some of her values come from the fact that she's either Christian or religious, which is interesting because, I mean, to be frank, I referenced the Ruslan KD podcast, when Ruslan was on this podcast, and that was interesting to watch because Ruslan was sort of walking people through oh yeah, Christians don't think you should do this, that, or the other. And he mentioned that they shouldn't sleep around or have sex before marriage. And that just blew everybody's mind. They did not have a lens by which to process that. And I thought it was amusing, but interesting, because I think a lot of us, or most people that grew up in church, that's just default. We're yeah, duh, you shouldn't do that. But when you actually start to live around and befriend, and I mean, at the very least, see podcasts like this, where you have people that clearly don't have that worldview, how big of a kind of a shift culturally that is for them to say that. And so he enters the question, right? Okay, well, what weight does your Christian values have upon, your view and how you deal with relationships? Now, unfortunately, Pearl isn't a believer, she said. She's got some issues with the church. She's about to say, I think she actually said before I pause it, she thinks feminism has really entered the church. And I want to talk about a little bit of that here in a second. But it's just very interesting. And I guess it's good, really, that Adam, which doesn't seem like he has a lot of Christians that kind of roll in his circle or have some sort of influence on him within his circle, at least knows that believers view relationships, dating, marriage, sex, all different than non-believers do, which is good. It just sort of it's unfortunate Pearl couldn't speak more to that. Apparently she has attended some Bible studies. She at least grew up in Catholic. I mean, she grew up within the Catholic Church, so I'm assuming she has some sort of background or understanding of Christianity. But she does go into here about the fact that feminism has sort of worked its way into the church. So let's let her work through that before I really give comment on that, because I think that's an interesting take. I think she's right, but let's talk through that after she kind of gives her 2 cents on that.
Well, I have like my thoughts on church. I wouldn't say religion.
I haven't been to church in like 20 years, but is that real? Like the average church like has like way more progressive stuff going on?
Super depends on denomination, right? I mean, if you look at our sermon reviews, you can tell sort of who's more progressive and who's not. I mean, Methodism is obviously heading that way, depending on what church you're in there. That's a split that's happening. We obviously have the Sunshine Cathedral, just did a review on them, incredibly progressive. And I think this comment by Adam is telling as far as like at least his take on what that means and why he thinks they're doing it.
I would say that they don't, like you're seeing gay flags in church.
Right.
Like what?
But if I mean, let's be real, like religion is kind of on the way out. Churches, like religion's becoming less and less popular. I feel like they probably have to like lean into that if they want to continue to exist.
So what's interesting is the take is that religion's on its way out. Now, again, I did a tweet about this a day or so ago, but the interesting thing is that like, depending on what study you read, it's either millennials are going back in church in droves, which is like a recent statistic Barna released, or like NPR, which did it more of a general study, but it included Christianity and showed that there are less people that identify as Christians. So like it kind of depends on what study you look at. Those are both fairly recent studies. But the general consensus, at least from Adam, is that Christianity is on its way out. Like people don't like religion anymore, which is, again, I think this all depends on perspective. This all depends on like who you're hanging with, who your friends are, what environment you're in. Because when I tweeted out, for example, the other day that like people tell me like people are leaving the church in droves, like I see that online all the time. But the churches I visit, my personal church, like I don't see that. I see people that are deeply committed to their faith, that love their local communities and their local body, and like they're not going anywhere. And so it's just, I think it's all perspective, where you're at, who you're asking, and that's also ever shifting, right? So like Barna's research on millennials going back, that's within the last 2 years. That's from 2020 to now. And so cultural shifts and events such as, COVID and all that, change cultures and change the trajectories of cultures. So is religion on its way out? I would say in general, no. You do have people leaving, but then you can get the whole theological question, were they ever really believers in the first place, or were they forced to go? And there's so much cultural history that builds up to generations leaving and who leaves and why they leave and all that. But his take is they're leaving, and the church sees that, and if they know, well, according to him, if the church wants to stay relevant, they have to sort of lean in to the current cultural narrative, which I think he's being way more observant and honest about that than a lot of churches are being, about that, because those that were like, no, we were just wrong all along. And I think he's right that there's a lot of churches are leaning into it, so that they are, how do I say this? So they're not so like, they don't seem so religious or so pharisaical. They're, but that's his take, which I think is interesting.
Well, that's the thing. Like they have to cater to women because women are the primary market for church. I think the church leaves women single, because when I was in the church, like when I was super into it right after college, they were like, you can only date in your church. And I was just like looking around. I'm like, what on earth?
What the that's not like an average rule that you have to date within the church, right?
Typically, like you have to be, that's why they have the term equally yoked.
Equally yoked?
Yeah. So, I mean, or they'll say you can date other Christian churches, but the other problem is they all are like 70% women, roughly.
Right.
So you hear this a lot, right? Depending on who you talk to online, like what account you follow, but the single Christian ladies that I know, in general, so a lot of these are more online because, again, the area I live in, again, this just goes perspective, demographics, all that. There's a lot of younger dudes in church. Not a lot, but more than you would probably have average. And so a lot of these women that are in these local churches know the guys that they're going to church with, grew up with those guys, went to high school with those guys. And so relationships in rural areas are still messy, but like there's a different way those relationships form than in like urban areas. And that's just how that's just general people, coming together things, but that has nothing to do with Christianity. But the idea is that these people are growing up together, at least in rural areas. But she's right in the sense that the people I talk to that are in other churches, especially single ladies, they can't find any. They can't find any guys that are worth marrying. And her whole point of the whole, the church is sort of geared toward women by and large, because it's 70%. And we're talking obviously within smaller churches, 600 under. That's the majority of people that attend. That's another statistic of, I think Barna even had that one as well in regards to, who attends. Well, it's usually middle to older women make up the vast majority of the congregation. So with that demographic there, they're making most of the decisions, and most of it's catered toward them because they're the ones coming. And so she's right. There's this real reality that the church in general is catered toward that specific age and gender demographic. And so there's not a lot of dudes that attend that, or will attend that. So then on the other side, they don't address this, but on the other side of that, that's where you get like the man up church culture, right? The, men become warriors sort of culture. Like they see a feminization of men within the church just because of the demographics that are in most churches, or statistically are in most churches. And so then you counteract that with like super bro culture in church. But I think she's right. There's a huge femininity within the church, but a lot of that is because the guys left. And so one, that makes it harder for single women to find a good Christian man. And secondly, that also shifts the entire programming and focus and what the church does.
If you look at like the younger people that are in the church, they're mostly women, and the guys are like kind of simpy, like a bit. So, like I've heard guys say like the girls in church are worse than the girls outside of church.
Like I would like to think that I'm respectful of everybody's religious beliefs and shit, but if you're a young dude and you're spending a lot of time in church, I mean,
well, it's just
what you really need this much help to get through the day, like.
So that's very interesting, right? So his take is that if you're a young guy in church a lot, then automatically you're weak and need help. Which is his assumption of why you go. Which here in a minute he'll actually say, or he said before, he hasn't been in church in 20 years. So a lot of that, probably some of that at least, comes from the idea that church attendance, at least for guys, is based upon the need for help and weakness. Two things that he probably doesn't perceive himself to be. So because he doesn't see himself in need of help, he doesn't see himself as weak, then he sees no purpose of church because, one, he probably does see what Pearl's already pointed out, 70% of churches are filled with or ran by women, most of those middle to upper age women. And so, like, why would he go? Like, what's the point of him going if the guys that are there he can't relate to because he at least perceives them to be weak and in need of help, and they use it sort of as a crutch to make them better, and he doesn't need either one of those things, so why would he go? I think that's really interesting. Again, this is somebody that hasn't been in church for 20 years, but that's his take on the church, at least, is that the church is leaning into more progressive policies because if they don't, they're going to die. So they're sort of at their last sort of death breaths here, and the guys that are still left in church are the simpy, weak people that need help. And so why would I go if all of that's true? Why would I go to church? Basically, it seems to be Adam's thought here, which is interesting because even if I wouldn't say that's accurate, clearly, but it is interesting to see that like that's his thought. Now, not that Adam speaks for all 35 to 45-year-old men, but he probably does have his finger on the pulse of 35 to 45-year-old men, and probably all the way down to 25. This podcast has 4.5 million subscribers. And so this video, I think at the time that I'm reviewing it, has like 125K views. And most of those, if I had to guess, were dudes. And so if they're watching this, if they're pushing, the like button. They're basically co-signing, like, yeah, that's why would I go to church if it's for weak dudes that need help and it's just a bunch of old ladies there? Like, why would I attend? So that's an interesting take, or at least an interesting opinion / observation. And Pearl's sort of agreeing, like, yeah, they're all simpy. They're not worth dating. And they, it's going to be hard to find a guy at church anyway.
I just don't understand.
I mean, I just think they don't. Like, I respect people that are religious and that are really religious, and I feel like I could be really religious. I just haven't really found like the right place, maybe. Like, I just feel like feminism has infiltrated the church, and like they encourage men to take unfair deals because it's like okay. When I was in Catholic school, I've always been me, right? Just opinionated, just like, and they would always have these chastity speakers, which are basically like people that come to the church or the school and they'll say like, don't have sex until you're married. And it's always like a ran through girl with the guy that like waited. And that's kind of an unfair deal because the guy has to wait to give his commitment to a girl that's already had sex. So it's like, it's like, what does he get out of the deal?
Do you actually think...
See, that's interesting. Now, they're about to go into a different topic, which is why I stopped it, because I want to talk about that before we go into the next topic, because I think it's a very interesting one in relation to culture and Christianity. But her point was that the church encourages guys to take bad deals, which is interesting, because both Adam and Pearl are sort of missing the idea of what church actually is, right? It's not a social club. It's not a club to come together to find somebody to marry. It's not like it's not a place to come if you feel like you're weak and you need like help. In regards to like this idea of I'm a weak dude, please make me a better man. Like that's not the purpose, like sole purpose of the church. Obviously, Jesus's life, death, resurrection will change an individual. Your heart and mind will be renewed. You'll have reconciliation with the Father, and you will become, you'll become, a believer, and you'll start walking in the way of the Lord, and that will change your life. That will make you, you'll be in the process of sanctification, which will change you into, if you're a man, it'll start to transform you. Hopefully you have good godly men around you. Titus 2, right? They can teach you self-control and can teach you, how to walk in the way of the Lord like a man should. And same thing for women. Hopefully you have Titus 2 women there that will help you develop yourself as the scriptures state, right? Through sanctification in the word. But that's not like the soul, like that's a side effect. Like that's part of the, I don't want to say package, but that's what should be expected as a result of salvation. Like a healthy church does X, Y, Z, but a healthy church only does that because they follow the scriptures and they love Jesus. So they're both really missing the point here in regards to, the church is telling you, just marry her. She's the only girl you're going to get. You're not going to find, somebody that hasn't slept around. So you, even though you were really good, you get the raw deal. I mean, that's what Pearl's kind of presenting. And the idea is that that's not how it's two people coming together, two believers, hopefully within the church, right? Coming together, two redeemed individuals, renewed in their hearts and minds with the pursuit to follow the Lord wherever he leads them. Hopefully that'll be children for them. Maybe it won't be. Maybe that'll just mean that they'll be, examples to other people within their local body. The idea though, like there's like, it's not about setting people up or making you better morally for the sake of being better morally. It's a whole different thing. But anyway, it's a very interesting take that they have here. Now, they are going to move on to sex before marriage and virginity in general, which I think this is a very interesting conversation because I don't know. This is going to vary based upon like where you grew up and probably the denomination you were in, and if your parents were conservative, if they weren't. Like this whole conversation is incredibly interesting that they're about to have. So let's hop in.
A guy or a girl waiting till they're married to have sex is a good idea.
I think if they're both virgins, yeah. I mean, that's what I can't name like the study off the top of my head, but if you look at body count when it comes to girls, like the fewer partners they have, the more likely they are to be happy after a certain amount of time. It's like after 10 years. Right. But the best outcomes are when both of them are virgins.
I feel like you need to have sex to understand if you have good sexual chemistry.
How would you know?
By having sex.
No, but I'm saying if you're both virgins, how would you know?
I know, but then like you're just sort of, I mean, I think a woman getting into a relationship, a serious relationship, as serious as marriage, without having a wide variety of experiences. You're just kind of asking, you're creating a ticking time bomb where she's going to at some point want to know what the fuck else is going on in life. And I've seen this over and over with people that I knew who got.
So he's going to get into this as far as examples of his own life, but this is very interesting. Now, admittedly, I grew up pretty sheltered. For some people that are watching this or listening, you would probably call it like uber sheltered, right? I don't regret that. I actually thank my parents pretty often for that, for doing that, and making sure like I just wasn't exposed to the entire world all at once, because that would have been terrible. But one of the interesting things here is that Adam for sure sides on the side of like basically if somebody came to him and hey, we're getting married, and he found out one or both of them wasn't a virgin, he'd be like, yo, that's a bad idea. Like that would be his advice. He's not happy about that, which again, I wouldn't expect him to be. He doesn't know Jesus. He thinks that, you know, having multiple partners is a great idea. But the interesting thing here that I hope you see, that like when I heard this, I was like, wow, this is incredible, the difference in perspective. And so when for example, when believers say, you know, you should save yourself until marriage, this you shouldn't sleep around, this matters, like this is why, and I know this is a controversial take for some Christians, but you shouldn't live together before you get married, and you shouldn't sleep together before you get married, even if you know you're getting married to them. Like that's some crazy take for some reason, but the idea is that like the scriptures are saying that you're supposed to have a commitment to one person, that one person is the one person you are with, that you are only with that one person, and that is so dynamically different from the world. I'm studying early church history right now, and one of the interesting things is that like this is actually, interestingly enough, one of the things that the early Christians were like the Romans thought that they were so odd for. So this dynamic isn't new, clearly. It's just replaying itself. But the Romans were like, you don't go to the temple prostitutes. Like you are faithful to your one person. Wow, that's weird. Like they didn't get it. They were like, why don't you do that? Why are you so faithful to this one individual? And the Christians were faithful to one because they said, hey, no, this is how God commands us to enter into this covenant together, because this covenant is actually a picture of Christ and the church. This is also echoes back obviously to like even in the Old Testament Hosea, right? This idea that like God is the faithful husband to the unfaithful wife. But in the New Testament, we see Paul saying like, no, this marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ and the church. This is supposed to be an image to everyone else, which it was in the early church. Like they were like, why do you do that? And they're like, well, because of Jesus. And so now when we live in a culture like Adam is coming from, his cultural perspective, by the way, like I've already stated, is not a minority position by any means, especially if you're in like, you know, dense urban areas or cultural centers. And so as a believer, especially if you haven't had sex, especially if you're a virgin, there is like this shock and awe, like, hold on, you haven't? And it goes as far as to where Adam would even be like, bro, like, no, you shouldn't get married yet, man. You should like go sow your wild oats or something, because, and here's the interesting thing. The reason he seems to have reached that conclusion is because he says, if you don't, you're going to be tempted to do that later on, which I think is incredibly interesting, because God in his good grace has built into his word, especially again, Titus 2, this idea that Christians, when we have the Spirit, we have the gift of self-control. We're supposed to exercise self-control. So it's not that the scriptures say, oh no, you won't be tempted at all, man. Nah, you won't be tempted. Adam's right. Like there is this temptation that comes just by nature of being human. But his take and the Christian's take is two different things. He says, I am not tempted because I've already done it all and it's just boring now. Like it's not exciting anymore. So it's like, I just got it out of my system essentially. And the Christian take is, I don't do it because I am able to exercise self-control with the help of the Holy Spirit. So it's not that the temptation isn't there. It's just that Adam decided to get rid of that temptation by just like going extreme and burning himself out on it. And the Christian says, I am going to honor God and exercise self-control with the help of the Holy Spirit in order to be faithful to my spouse, which is something, by the way, that Adam admits in this podcast. He's not faithful. He does OF all the time, apparently. Apparently that's some of his like side hustle. Like he puts videos out all the time where he's sleeping around with people. So it's not that he's being faithful, though it is interesting. He defines that a little differently in this podcast, but whatever. But the point is that like Christianity has a different trajectory than the modern cultural idea of how you're faithful, what that means, how you're supposed to deal with temptation, all of that Christianity has an answer for, but culture in general. And again, I'm just using Adam as like a prototype here. Culture basically says like, that's impossible. And you shouldn't exercise self-control, seems to be his take.
Got married when they were young, when they were virgins, and it's just inevitably like one or both people ends up wilding out or wanting to have some more experiences. For me, the reason why I'm able to be so comfortable and secure in my relationship is the fact that I've hundreds of people and I know exactly what's out there, and I don't feel tempted by any of it.
Yeah, that is a dynamic. Rollo has talked about that, where basically like if the girl gets too young, like it's basically like the virgins of today aren't the virgins of yesterday, because the virgins of today still have social media and can like hear things and see things and feel like they're.
So the interesting thing that Pearl brings out here is like a downstream effect of growing up in a Christian culture, like that has maybe not a Christian culture, but has Christian morality sort of weaved into it. And so by the time we get to where we're at now in history, you have sort of the vestiges of that kind of falling away, but you still have some of that morality kind of baked in still from years and decades and hundreds of years ago, that you have this idea that you should still like do it, or there's some people that still hold on that they should still do it, even if they're not believers. You sort of have like the red-pilled conservative non-Christians that would have that take. And then this idea is that, well, you can't do that, though. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it is impossible to be abstinent in today's world. I mean, people are adamant that, like, there's no way you could do it. I know a lot of people that are abstinent right now. Now, again, the difference is that they are believers exercising self-control in their daily lives. That is the crucial difference. So what Adam and Pearl are talking about here, I understand operating from that worldview. You're like, yeah, you should try, but you probably won't be able to do that because there's so much around you that you're gonna do it eventually. So the best you can do is like pump the brakes as much as possible to prevent a high body count and just have a very low one. But there's not this idea, and I don't think you would ever hear a cultural, like a podcast outside of Christianity, make the statement that you should be abstinent, because it's seen as impossible. But the beautiful message of the gospel is that with Christ, you're able to exercise self-control and not do that. Again, not that the temptation's not there, but the fact that you're in a local body, you have people around you to help you keep accountable. You have, more importantly, the Spirit there to help you exercise self-control. And you have all of these sort of mechanisms in place to help you walk with the Lord well. That's something that is completely absent from the worldview that they're operating out of.
You're missing out. So yeah, I would say that happens.
Like, I can't think of a more foolproof plan for me being miserable than me like valuing like, innocence so much that I end up wifing up some 19, 20-year-old virgin who doesn't know anything about life, who's gonna fucking be looking at everything else out there as like so tantalizing and interesting. It's like I feel way more comfortable with somebody who's been around the block that actually like knows what's out there.
So the interesting thing here is that, and I don't know if he meant to make this connection, but the idea is sort of like this idolization of virginity, which maybe he is making that connection, that Christians or religious folks have sort of this idealized version of, this virginity, that you should pursue that. But again, operating out of, I don't think that's true, but I'm sure somebody would be like, oh yeah, I've definitely heard that. I don't recall a time where that's been a thing that I'm like, oh yeah, somebody said that, but I'm sure somebody has. But by and large, I don't think that's an actual take, like a factual take. But that at least is his perception or opinion on the subject. And then his idea being then like, well, I want to pursue her because she's going to get tempted by all this other stuff out in the world. So we stopped that at 54 minutes. Again, that was only 4 minutes of the entire podcast. But I found that incredibly interesting, that small section there that dealt specifically with Christianity, religion, and how sort of these two things cross over. Like, and their understanding of Christianity, their understanding of why, churches do particular things, and how that intersection of sexuality and Christianity come together. Again, I think it's crazy that we have people that go to churches claiming Christ that don't think that Christians should operate in a different way relationally in regards to sex. But it's true. Apparently, there's a lot of people out there that just, I guess, haven't read the scriptures, or if they have, they're just not perceiving it within the context that they should be. But the most interesting takeaway for me, I'd like to hear your idea here, but the most interesting takeaway for me of this little section of podcast, right, 30 minutes for 4 minutes, basically, is that there is such a stark difference between Adam's view of how people should operate relationally, both, within marriage and virginity and sex, and how all that sort of blends together, versus how the scriptures talk about and how Christians perceive those exact same things. So let me know what you guys think, because I think this is a topic that, unless you're around people that have the worldview that Adam has, I think this may have come off a little shocking to you. Again, I live in a fairly conservative area, but we have some people that sort of lean pretty heavy in the direction of like Adam would, that I work with. So it's not entirely shocking, but it is like, it's sort of like mind blowing every time I hear it, because I'm like, wow, you think that way. So do you have friends like this? Are you maybe somebody that operates out of that worldview? What's your take, right? Just give me your take on this little clip, because it was so interesting to me that that this conversation, one, misunderstood Christianity so bad, but also that the implications of a take like theirs and the effects that has not only on them, but on the rest, like downstream from their thinking process.